We're still more than a year away from the first 2020 primary, but more than 400 Americans are already running for president. According to the Federal Election Commission's database, 430 people have filed the paperwork to run for president. Most of those candidates will never see a debate stage. Only about 20 have raised any campaign cash. But the 2020 field, especially on the Democratic side, is expected to be large. And joining me now from Des Moines, Iowa, is Washington Post national reporter David Weigel. Dave also writes a campaign newsletter for the Post called The Trailer. Dave, welcome. Great to have you with us. Your latest edition of The Trailer focuses on sorting out the 2020 field. So who is considered in the top tier so far?
Well, that's just it. People can't even agree what to call the tiers. I was just talking to an operative in Iowa a couple minutes ago, and he clarified them as the people who are here all the time already and the people who are coming here. So there are some candidates who are polling at 1% or not polling at all, who've been in Iowa and New Hampshire for months and months. Then there's general agreement there is a tier of people who are well-known and who poll well, just that could change. And that includes Joe Biden, Beto O'Rourke, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris. That is a tier where if you talk to an average Iowa Democrat, New Hampshire Democrat, they're aware they exist. They generally like them. They're not sure who they're going to support yet.
So outside of the ranked tiers, and like you said, people can't even agree on how many tiers there are, there were some people you spoke to who had other ways, perhaps slightly more humorous ways, of sorting the 2020 field. Can you run us through some of the more interesting classifications you came across?
Well, one came from a Democrat in Congress who will not be named, and that should be old white guys and everybody else. Saying that, with all respect, there are a few Democrats who are over 70 who will run, and in his or her mind, they kind of would blur together for people. There was a big opening for anyone younger, which is everybody. Well, it ranges from some people in their 30s who are considering running, like Pete Buttigieg will be here tomorrow, the mayor of South Bend, and people in their 60s like Sherrod Brown and Elizabeth Warren.
Right.
So that was one classification. One was a tier system that went all the way to 4 with the cranks in the 4th tier, which is helpful because there are some people who are already running for president without much money, without much attention. And then there were some attempts to separate it based on the senators, the congressmen, and then everybody else, the people who are going to be coming to this from Washington in some capacity, which meant they had a voting record that you can talk about. I mean, again, I was just another operative I was talking to today very quickly brought up Beto O'Rourke voting with Donald Trump 30% of the time. So somebody's already done the math.
So, Dave, there was also an interesting sorting method that put the billionaires in one group and the non-billionaires in another. How many billionaires are there, first of all, who may be running for president? And what does the polling tell you about how voters feel about people who can self-fund their campaigns?
Well, there's at least 3. There, Mike Bloomberg, who has the only political experience we're talking about in this field of billionaires, mayor of New York for 12 years. There is Harold Schultz, the former CEO of Starbucks, and then there's Tom Steyer, the mega donor behind NextGen, Vote Need to Impeach, those organizations, who has been to. They've all been to Iowa. With the exception of Schultz has not been here for a political event in any kind of clear way. And they're all very different. I mean, Harold Schultz, for example, is the only person in the Democratic field, however you expand it, who said that we need to talk about reducing Social Security benefits. I think not in those terms, but they're the driver of the debt, which is not something that a lot of Democrats say right now. Whereas Tom Steyer is running as a progressive, probably as progressive as anybody in the race except for Bernie Sanders. But at the same time, you don't find much of an appetite with Democrats for somebody who's just going to self-fund or for somebody without much experience.
All right, so since we talked a little bit about billionaires and possibly self-funding their campaigns, I want to ask you about a new litmus test emerging in the Democratic Party, one around corporate money. So which potential 2020 candidates are accepting cash from big companies, and which ones are making a point of foregoing it?
Well, it's very thorny because there are Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, a few Democrats followed Bernie Sanders' lead in saying they would not take any corporate PAC money, which is a very specific category. For a lot of candidates, they wouldn't be getting much of that anyway. But, for example, they're not taking any money from ExxonMobil's political PAC. Now, they might take money from employees of that company, and this is something that Beto O'Rourke already it was not an issue in the Texas Senate race. It's an issue now. The fact that he's had some money from some executives in these companies became a litmus test for some people further to the left who said, well, how can we trust you on a climate agenda if you take any money in any way from anyone who works for the energy industry?
Right.
Then there's a separate question of whether you would create a super PAC. Now, by definition, a super PAC doesn't need to be funded by corporate money. Again, anyone can fund it. Just one wealthy person, if John Huntsman's father funded his super PAC in 2012, for example. But even that is viewed very negatively among Democrats. And it was viewed negatively among Republicans, too. This is, I think, a little bit forgotten in Trump's toolbox of advantages that he had in 2016 that might not have now, is the idea that he had no support whatsoever, had no outside donors, had no super PAC, whereas someone like Jeb had to rely on rich donors propping his campaign up. Democrats had even more of an animus toward the idea that wealthy people are propping your campaign up. So I think you might only see one or two candidates allow a super PAC to exist on their behalf. Everyone else, even if it might cost them money, they think they're going to make Kirsten Gillibrand's or Elizabeth Warren's, Bernie Sanders. They might see more of an advantage in saying, like Bernie Sanders or unlike a lot of Democrats, I'm not going to create a super PAC. I'm not going to take any money from with a place retained. And the only risk there I would point to is that there's a lot of interest from both people on the far left and conservatives who are going to be doing opposition research and trying to get people on the far left angry at the candidates. I mean, I think it's a big opening here is by saying, well, yeah, they said that, but look at this check that somebody got from somebody who's invested in the private prison industry. There's a real chance of kind of a race, almost a race to the top. I don't know what to call it. Looking for the cleanest possible candidate in a way that keeps getting redefined.
All right, Dave Weigel in Iowa. Thank you so much for sharing your insight with us.
Thank you. And I'm not one of the 400 candidates who's announced already, just to be clear.
Just to be clear on that point. Thank you.
Thank you.